The Great Hall of the Galactic Defense Force headquarters was filled with excited chatter. Today was a special day. After 10 years of work, the galaxy's strongest defense system would be shown to everyone. Captain Jai-Ho Park stood quietly in the back of the room. He was the only human there, and he looked different from the other beings around him. While they wore fancy, shining uniforms with lots of decorations, Jai-Ho's dark blue Earth uniform was simple and plain, but his eyes were sharp as he watched the stage. Dr. Du-Young Lee walked to the center of the stage. Her white lab coat moved softly as she walked. She smiled at the crowd and began to speak. "Distinguished members of the Galactic Defense Force, today we make history," she said, pressing a button on her control pad. A large screen behind her lit up, showing a beautiful blue energy shield surrounding a planet. "I give you the galaxy's ultimate shield. No weapon in known space can break through it." The crowd clapped and cheered. Commander Ta-Hyun Choi, standing in the front row, looked especially pleased. He had supported this project from the start. "The shield uses advanced energy matrices," Dr. Du-Young continued. "It can stop any energy weapon, any explosive, and any known form of attack. We have tested it against every weapon system in the galaxy." Jai-Ho raised his hand. The room went quiet. It was rare for anyone to interrupt such an important presentation. Admiral Ha-Won Kim, the leader of the Galactic Defense Force, looked at Jai-Ho with interest. "Yes, Captain Park. You have a question." "Not a question, Admiral," Jai-Ho said clearly. "A request. I would like to test this shield." Commander Ta-Hyun laughed loudly. "With what? Earth weapons? Your civilization just learned to leave your planet a few years ago." Jai-Ho didn't get angry. Instead, he smiled slightly. "Yes, Commander, with a human weapon. One based on what you might call primitive technology." Dr. Du-Young looked curious. "Captain, we have tested the shield against thousands of weapons. What makes you think your test would be different?" "Because," Jai-Ho said, walking to the front of the room, "sometimes the simplest answer is the one people miss. My weapon doesn't use fancy energy beams or advanced explosives. It uses basic physics, something so simple that advanced civilizations might overlook it." Admiral Ha-Won leaned forward in her chair. She had worked with humans before, and she knew they often saw things differently. "Tell us more, Captain." "I have modified an old Earth weapon called a railgun," Jai-Ho explained. "It's nothing fancy. Just a piece of metal thrown very, very fast. I would like to test it against the shield." The room burst into laughter again, but Admiral Ha-Won raised her hand for silence. She saw something in Jai-Ho's eyes, a quiet confidence that made her curious. "Dr. Du-Young," the Admiral said, "would you allow this test?" The scientist looked thoughtful. "There is no risk to the shield. It can stop anything." She nodded. "Yes, we will allow it. It might be good to show everyone exactly how strong the shield is, even against primitive weapons." Jai-Ho bowed slightly. "Thank you. I will need 3 days to set up my equipment." As he walked out of the hall, Commander Ta-Hyun called after him. "Don't be too disappointed when your little gun fails, human." Jai-Ho didn't reply, but the small smile never left his face as he walked away, already planning his preparations. Sometimes, he thought, being underestimated was the greatest advantage of all. The news of Captain Jai-Ho's challenge spread quickly through the Galactic Defense Force headquarters. In the main dining hall, Commander Ta-Hyun sat with a group of senior officers, laughing about the situation. "Can you believe the nerve of that human?" Ta-Hyun said, shaking his head. "A railgun. That's technology from their fossil fuel era. It's like bringing a stone to break down a fortress wall." The other officers nodded and smiled, but Admiral Ha-Won, who was passing by, stopped at their table. "Commander," she said firmly, "I remember another time when people laughed at humans. Do you recall the Mars Racing Championship?" Ta-Hyun's smile faded slightly. "Everyone knew that story. The aliens had laughed when humans entered the planet-wide race with wheeled vehicles instead of hover cars. Then the humans won, because their simple wheels worked better in the Martian dust storms that disabled the fancy anti-gravity systems. That was different, Admiral Tahyun argued. This is about pure physics. Dr. Du Young's shield can stop anything. It's based on mathematical principles that humans haven't even discovered yet. Meanwhile, in a quiet corner of the research wing, Dr. Du Young was reviewing Captain Jai-Ho's test request forms. She frowned at the numbers on her screen. The human wanted to position his railgun exactly 1,000 kilometers from the test shield. That was unusually specific. She walked to her window and looked out at the testing ground. In the distance, she could see Jai-Ho and 2 other humans setting up their equipment. They worked steadily, measuring everything carefully. Dr. Du Young, her assistant, entered the room. Commander Tahyun has organized a big viewing party for the test. He says it will be good for everyone to see how superior our technology is. Du Young nodded slowly. Yes, I'm sure it will be educational. But something bothered her. She had worked with human scientists before. They were simple, yes, but also clever in unexpected ways. In his temporary workshop, Jai-Ho worked quietly on his railgun. He had stripped away everything fancy, focusing only on one thing: speed. His computer showed a simulation of the test again and again. Each time, he adjusted something small. A shadow fell across his work table. He looked up to see Admiral Ha-Won standing there. "Captain Park," she said, "may I ask you something?" When he nodded, she continued, "Why are you really doing this?" Jai-Ho put down his tools. "Admiral, do you know why humans survived so long on Earth? Because we learned from everything around us. We watched how animals hunt, how plants grow, how rivers flow. Sometimes the biggest discoveries come from the simplest things." "And what simple thing have you discovered?" she asked. Jai-Ho smiled. "That's the interesting part, Admiral. I haven't discovered anything new. I'm just using something very old in a way no one expects." The Admiral studied him for a moment. "Commander Tahyun is making this very public. If you fail, Earth will be embarrassed." "And if I succeed?" Jai-Ho asked quietly. "Then a lot of very important people will be very upset," she answered. Jai-Ho turned back to his work. Sometimes people need to be upset to learn something new. As Admiral Ha-Won walked away, she heard the sound of Jai-Ho's tools resuming their work. She had a feeling that in 2 days, everything would change. She just wasn't sure how. The morning sun cast long shadows across the testing ground as Captain Jai-Ho worked on his railgun. He had removed the outer casing, exposing the long barrel to the cool air. Next to him, his computer displayed a series of calculations that would look simple to most galactic engineers. A small crowd had gathered at a safe distance. They pointed and whispered, some taking pictures of what they thought would be a famous failure. Jai-Ho ignored them, focusing on his work. Dr. Du Young approached, holding her datapad. She had been watching the preparations with growing interest. "Captain, your power requirements seem very low," she said, looking at his equipment. "Are you sure you have enough energy to launch your projectile?" Jai-Ho looked up from his work. "That's the interesting thing, Doctor. We don't need as much power as you might think. We're not trying to break through the shield with force alone." "Then what are you trying to do?" she asked. Instead of answering directly, Jai-Ho picked up a small metal ball from his workbench. It was perfectly smooth and looked very ordinary. "This is our projectile," he said. "Would you like to hold it?" Du Young took the ball. It felt surprisingly heavy for its size. "What is it made of?" "Just steel," Jai-Ho said. "Nothing special. Nothing advanced. The same material humans have been using for thousands of years." He took the ball back and held it up to the light. Sometimes the best solutions don't need new materials or complex technology. They just need a new way of thinking about old problems. Commander Tahyun arrived then, surrounded by his usual group of admirers. "Ah, showing off your primitive weapon, Captain," he said loudly. I hope you're also preparing your apology speech for when it fails. Jai-Ho carefully placed the steel ball into the railgun's loading chamber. Commander, did you know that on Earth, we have a saying, the higher the tree, the harder it falls? Is that supposed to mean something? Ta-Hyun asked, frowning. It means that overconfidence can be dangerous, Admiral Ha-Won said, walking up to join them. She had been quietly observing from a distance. Captain, how are the preparations going? Almost finished, Admiral, Jai-Ho replied. We just need to complete the final calibrations. Do-Young was still studying Jai-Ho's computer screen. Something about the numbers bothered her. They were simple, yes, but there was an elegance to them that she hadn't expected. The trajectory calculations, the velocity figures, the energy distribution, everything was stripped down to its most basic form. Captain, she said slowly, these calculations, they're not trying to overwhelm the shield, are they? Jai-Ho smiled slightly. No, Doctor. As I said, we're not trying to use force alone. We're using something much more interesting. Harmony. Harmony. Ta-Hyun scoffed. This isn't a music performance, human. This is advanced defensive technology. Everything has a natural frequency, Jai-Ho explained, making a final adjustment to his equipment. Everything can be disrupted if you find the right rhythm. Even the strongest shield has a weakness. You just have to know where to look. Admiral Ha-Won watched as understanding slowly dawned on Do-Young's face. The scientist looked at her calculations again, then at Jai-Ho's simple steel ball, then back at her datapad. Impossible, Do-Young whispered. You couldn't have figured that out. It's too simple. Jai-Ho finished for her. He closed the loading chamber with a soft click. Tomorrow, we'll see if simple is enough. Dr. Do-Young couldn't sleep that night. She sat in her laboratory, surrounded by glowing screens showing her shield designs. Something about Captain Jai-Ho's simple calculations kept bothering her. She pulled up the shield's basic structure again. The energy patterns flowed in perfect harmony, creating an unbreakable wall. At least, that's what she had always thought. Running late-night calculations. Admiral Ha-Won's voice made her jump. Admiral, Do-Young said, turning around. Yes, I was just reviewing some data. She paused, then asked, have you ever heard the story of the opera singer who broke a glass with her voice? The Admiral nodded. An old Earth story. The singer's voice matched the natural frequency of the glass, causing it to shatter. Exactly, Do-Young said, turning back to her screens. I always thought it was just a simple Earth legend, but now. She pulled up Jai-Ho's trajectory calculations. Look at this. His railgun isn't just firing a projectile. It's firing it at a very specific speed. Admiral Ha-Won stepped closer to look at the numbers. What does that mean? Every energy shield has a pulse, a rhythm to how it deflects objects. Do-Young explained. Our shield uses complex patterns to handle different types of attacks. But what if? She typed quickly, running a new simulation. The screen showed Jai-Ho's steel ball hitting the shield, but instead of the usual impact pattern, something strange happened. The shield's energy began to ripple in an unusual way. It's like dropping a stone in a pond, Do-Young whispered. The ripples spread out in perfect circles. But if you drop more stones at just the right time and place, the ripples add together, the Admiral finished, making bigger waves. Yes. Do-Young stood up and began pacing. We designed the shield to handle massive energy weapons, explosive forces, even antimatter. But we never thought about something so simple. A small object, moving at exactly the right speed, hitting at exactly the right point. She ran another simulation. This time, she could see how the shield's energy patterns would react to Jai-Ho's projectile. Each impact would create a tiny disruption. Nothing dangerous alone, but if timed perfectly. That's why he wanted the railgun exactly 1,000 kilometers away, she said. That distance lets him match the shield's pulse perfectly. The projectile will arrive at exactly the right moment in the shield's energy cycle. Admiral Howon watched the simulation play again. Can you stop it? Do Young shook her head. The shield's strength is also its weakness. Its patterns are too perfect, too regular. Changing them now would take days of recalibration. Should we cancel the test? The Admiral asked. Do Young thought for a moment. No, she said finally. If I'm right, we need to see this. Our shields protect dozens of worlds. If a human can find this weakness using simple physics, then others might find it too, the Admiral finished. She looked out the window at the testing ground, where Jaiho's railgun sat quietly under the stars. Commander Taehyun won't be happy. No, Do Young agreed. But sometimes the best lessons are the hardest ones to learn. As they talked, the night slowly turned to dawn. In a few hours, they would all learn just how powerful simplicity could be. The morning of the test arrived with clear skies. A large crowd had gathered at the observation platform, 1 kilometer away from the shield testing area. The air buzzed with excitement and mockery. Commander Taehyun stood at the front of the viewing area, wearing his finest uniform. He had invited reporters from every major galactic news network to witness what he called the triumph of advanced technology over primitive methods. Captain Jaiho worked quietly at his station, checking each part of his railgun one final time. His movements were calm and precise. He paid no attention to the whispers and laughs from the crowd behind him. Final systems check, Jaiho said to his computer. Power levels. Power at optimal levels. The computer responded. All systems ready. Admiral Howon approached Jaiho's station. She noticed dark circles under his eyes. Did you sleep at all, Captain? No, Admiral, Jaiho replied, making one last adjustment to his controls. Too much to prepare. Dr. Du Young arrived next, carrying her data pad. She had also spent a sleepless night, running simulation after simulation. Each one showed the same result, but she still couldn't quite believe it. The shield is at full power, she reported. All energy patterns are stable. She paused, then added quietly, and perfectly regular. Jaiho nodded, understanding her hidden message. She had discovered his theory about the shield's rhythmic weakness. He respected her choice not to change the shield's settings before the test. Commander Taehyun walked over, his boots shining in the morning sun. Well, human, are you ready to embarrass yourself and your planet? We're ready to begin the test, Commander, Jaiho replied simply. Taehyun turned to the crowd. Distinguished guests, he announced loudly, today we will witness the futility of primitive technology against modern galactic science. Captain Park of Earth will attempt to breach our perfect shield with what he calls a railgun, a weapon that belongs in a museum. The crowd laughed. Some took pictures of Jaiho and his simple-looking weapon. But Admiral Howon noticed that not everyone was laughing. Several senior scientists were watching with serious faces. They had worked with humans before. Beginning countdown, Jaiho announced. His computer started counting backward from 60 seconds. Dr. Du Young checked her instruments one last time. The shield hummed with power, its energy patterns flowing in perfect, predictable waves. She looked at Jaiho's railgun, positioned exactly 1,000 kilometers from the target, the distance that would let his projectile match the shield's pulse perfectly. 30 seconds, the computer announced. Commander Taehyun smiled confidently. Don't worry, human. We won't make you apologize publicly when you fail. 15 seconds. Admiral Howon watched Jaiho's face. The human showed no worry, no doubt. He had the calm look of someone who knew exactly what would happen next. 10 seconds. The crowd grew quiet. Despite their mockery, something about Jaiho's quiet confidence made them nervous. 5, 4, 3. Dr. Du Young held her breath. Her instruments were ready to record everything. 2, 1. Jaiho pressed the firing button. The railgun hummed to life. Launch. The steel ball left the railgun with barely a sound. In the viewing area, many people looked confused. They had expected a loud explosion, or at least an impressive light show. Instead, there was only a soft hum as the projectile began its journey. Dr. Du Young's eyes were fixed on her instruments. The ball was moving faster than anything she had ever measured before. Not with the raw power of an energy weapon, but with perfect, precise speed. Impact in 10 seconds, Jaiho's computer announced calmly. Commander Ta-hyun laughed. That's it? That's your great weapon. I can barely see it. 8 seconds, the computer continued. Admiral Ha-won watched Dr. Du Young's face. The scientist's eyes were growing wider as she read her instruments. The projectile was approaching the exact speed Jaiho had calculated, the speed that would match the shield's energy pulse. 5 seconds. The crowd leaned forward. The tiny steel ball was now visible as a small dot approaching the shimmering shield. 3 seconds. Dr. Du Young's instruments began to show the shield's energy patterns. They flowed in perfect waves, just as they were designed to do. But now those perfect patterns seemed more like a weakness than a strength. 1 second. Time seemed to slow down. The steel ball struck the shield exactly where Jaiho had aimed. At first, nothing seemed to happen. The shield glowed slightly at the point of impact, absorbing the hit just as it was supposed to do. Commander Ta-hyun opened his mouth to speak, but Dr. Du Young raised her hand to stop him. Her instruments were showing something extraordinary. The shield's energy wasn't dispersing the impact as it should. Instead, the force of the hit was spreading through the shield's patterns like ripples in a pond. Each ripple matched the shield's natural pulse perfectly, growing stronger instead of weaker. Secondary effects beginning, Jaiho said quietly. The ripples in the shield grew larger. Where they met, they combined, creating peaks of energy that the shield was never designed to handle. The perfect, regular patterns that made the shield so strong were now working against it. Impossible, Commander Ta-hyun whispered. The shield began to glow brightly at certain points, places where the energy ripples met and combined. Dr. Du Young's instruments were showing readings she had never seen before. The shield's energy was cascading, each wave making the next one stronger. Shield frequency destabilizing, Dr. Du Young announced, her voice shaking slightly. Pattern collapse in 3, 2, 1. There was a flash of light, beautiful and terrifying at the same time. Where Jaiho's steel ball had struck, a perfect circle of energy pulsed outward. For a moment, the shield seemed to ripple like silk in the wind. Then, with a sound like breaking glass, a hole appeared in the galaxy's strongest shield. It wasn't large, barely bigger than Jaiho's steel ball. But it was there. A simple piece of metal, moving at exactly the right speed, had done what no advanced weapon had ever managed to do. The crowd stood in complete silence. Commander Ta-hyun's face had gone pale. Admiral Ha-won looked at Jaiho, who was calmly recording the test results in his computer. Test completed, Jaiho said simply. Results logged. Dr. Du Young's hands were shaking as she checked her final readings. The shield, it didn't fail because of power or force. It failed because of harmony, Jaiho finished for her. Sometimes the smallest push in the right place is stronger than the biggest push in the wrong place. The room was silent as Captain Jaiho Park stood before the Galactic Defense Council. 3 hours had passed since his simple steel ball had pierced the unbreakable shield. Now he faced the leaders of the galaxy's military forces. Admiral Ha-won sat at the center of the council table. To her right, Dr. Du Young was still studying the test results on her datapad. Commander Ta-hyun sat at the far end, his earlier confidence completely gone. Captain Park. Admiral Ha-won began. Please explain to the council exactly what happened today. Jaiho nodded and stepped forward. The explanation is simple, he said. Every shield you have built follows the same basic pattern. Like a heartbeat, it pulses with energy in a perfect rhythm. This makes it very strong against big attacks, but very weak against small ones that match its rhythm. He pulled out his small steel ball and held it up. On Earth, we learned about rhythm and harmony thousands of years ago. We learned that a singer's voice could break a glass if it matched the glass's natural frequency. We learned that soldiers had to break step when crossing bridges, or their marching could make the bridge collapse. Dr. Du Young stood up. "He's right," she said, showing her data to the council. "Our shields are too perfect, too regular." Captain Park's projectile created a resonance effect, like pushing a child on a swing. Each tiny push made the next one stronger, until the shield broke, Commander Tahyun finished quietly. "Not broke," Jai-Ho corrected. "Danced. The shield danced to the rhythm we played. And in dancing, it opened a door." Admiral Howon leaned forward. "How long have humans known about this weakness?" "We didn't know for sure until today," Jai-Ho answered honestly. "But we suspected. Humans have always looked for simple solutions to complex problems. Sometimes the oldest lessons are the most important ones." One of the council members spoke up. "But why show us this weakness? You could have kept this knowledge secret, used it in war if needed." Jai-Ho shook his head. "Because that would be dangerous for everyone. If we found this weakness, others would too. Better to share the knowledge and fix the problem together." Dr. Du Young nodded in agreement. "Captain Park is right. We need to redesign our shields, make them less perfect, less predictable. Sometimes a little chaos is stronger than perfect order." Commander Tahyun stood up slowly. His face showed that the words were difficult for him. I was wrong about Earth technology being primitive. Sometimes the simplest solutions are the most elegant ones." Admiral Howon looked around the room. "Then we have learned two valuable lessons today. First, that perfection can be a weakness, and second, that wisdom can come from unexpected places." She turned to Jai-Ho. "Captain Park, would you be willing to work with Dr. Du Young on developing new shield designs?" Jai-Ho smiled. "Of course, Admiral. Earth has many more simple lessons to share." As the council members filed out of the room, Dr. Du Young approached Jai-Ho. "You knew," she said. "You knew our love of perfect patterns would be our weakness." "Yes," Jai-Ho replied. "Because it's a very human weakness too. We had to learn the hard way that sometimes the strongest things bend instead of standing rigid. Sometimes the best defense is one that can dance." 6 months had passed since the day a simple steel ball had changed the galaxy's understanding of defense technology. In that time, many things had changed at the Galactic Defense Force headquarters. The main research lab looked very different now. Where there had once been only advanced alien technology, there were now simple Earth devices next to complex galactic machines. Captain Jai-Ho Park and Dr. Du Young had transformed the space into what they called a harmony lab. "The new shield is ready for testing," Du Young announced one morning. She stood before Admiral Howon and Commander Tahyun, who had come to see their latest work. The shield they had created together was unlike anything the galaxy had seen before. It didn't pulse with perfect rhythm like the old ones. Instead, it flowed and changed like waves in the ocean, never keeping the same pattern for long. "We call it the Dance Shield," Jai-Ho explained. "It learns from both Earth and galactic technology. Like a skilled dancer, it can change its rhythm at any moment." Commander Tahyun, who had become one of their strongest supporters, stepped forward to examine the control panel. "It's beautiful," he said. "Simple and complex at the same time, like nature itself." Admiral Howon smiled. In the past 6 months, she had watched the commander change from someone who looked down on simple technology to someone who now studied Earth's history for inspiration. "Shall we test it?" Du Young asked, her eyes bright with excitement. They moved to the testing area. Jai-Ho had set up his railgun again, but this time it was different. The simple weapon had been improved with galactic technology, while keeping its basic Earth principles. "Beginning test sequence," Jai-Ho announced. The new shield sparkled to life around the target. Unlike the old shield's steady blue glow, this one shifted and moved like the surface of a soap bubble. Beautiful patterns flowed across its surface, never repeating exactly the same way twice. Jai-Ho fired the railgun. The steel ball flew toward the shield, perfectly aimed and timed just as before. But this time, something different happened. As the ball approached, the shield's pattern shifted. It moved like water, bending around the projectile's rhythm instead of fighting it. The ball's energy spread out harmlessly across the shield's surface, like a ripple in a pond. "Amazing," Commander Tahyun whispered. "It's not just defending, it's adapting." "Yes," Du Young said proudly. "We learned from Earth's history. The strongest trees are not the ones that stand completely rigid, but the ones that can bend in the wind." Admiral Howon turned to Jai-Ho. "You've done more than just improve our shields, Captain. You've shown us a new way of thinking." Jai-Ho nodded. "And you've shown us that the best solutions come from working together. Earth's simple wisdom and galactic advanced science both have their place." As they walked back to the lab, Du Young was already talking about their next project. "We're thinking about applying these principles to spacecraft design," she said excitedly. "Imagine ships that could dance through space like Earth's sea creatures swim through water." Commander Tahyun laughed. "6 months ago, I would have called that primitive thinking. Now I know better. The universe has much to teach us, if we're humble enough to learn." Admiral Howon watched them go, remembering the day when a simple steel ball had taught them all a valuable lesson. Sometimes the biggest changes come from the smallest things. Sometimes the oldest wisdom lights the way to the newest discoveries. And sometimes the best way forward is to remember how to dance.